In the opening pages of Acid Death Fantasy, written by Luke Gearing and published by Melsonian Arts Council, you get a player character background. This is how Troika, the tabletop role-playing game, communicates its characters to you, the player. You roll dice and get a random background to play as. Now, in a book full of things like number 12, a shaved bear, number 24, a sandworm rider, or number 35, the freshwater grub agent, it's very likely you might get something goofy or just plain weird. Luke Gearing has said that most everything he writes is meant to be funny, at least on some level. But in my time with the book, I rolled what might be considered a rather tame background. The one in particular is number 16, a Sultanless Guard. The sultans in Acid Death Fantasy are numerous, and I quote, "They compete endlessly in petty games, inevitably forgotten as the hubris of the current ruler causes a fall." So they're a bunch of people squabbling for what little power they can grab before their tiny empire collapses and another one takes its place. Ultimately forgettable and meaningless in the grand scheme of things. So I rolled a 16, got the Sultanless Guard as my character, and it felt very much like handing a pitch or a bio to an actor for me to take on the role. I'm sure with enough social lubrication and maybe a little liquid courage, I could give a monologue as the Sultanless Guard, wax poetically about the fire, the destruction as my sultan lost the final battle. Or maybe something more subdued, a leaking of courage and people before the Sultan sold the lot of us to the next ruler, like some kind of Kafkaesque bureaucratic Dune spinoff. But when you roll for these backgrounds, you don't just get a name or a profession. Each one also gets a few possessions, items of some importance. The shaved bear I mentioned earlier, for instance, gets a bag full of, well, the hair that was shaved off. The Sultanless Guard, on the other hand, gets a primary weapon, a secondary weapon, scaled armor, and, well, then Luke reveals something that isn't quite funny. The Sultanless Guard also gets a love letter from someone in the fallen sultanate, which, after reading, immediately sparked the idea for this entire video. It made me write. But what is it about it that's so special? It has to be more than just a love letter, I think. There's something there that caught my eye immediately and set my mind on fire, at least more so than the bag of shaved hair. And I believe it has to do with role-playing, like capital R role-playing. Akira Kurosawa is a legend of filmmaking. If you're a film buff, or even just someone who enjoys movies, you've probably seen one of his films, or a remake of one of his films. Seven Samurai was remade as The Magnificent Seven here in the US during the Western craze, and that was also remade not too long ago. Beyond that, there's High and Low, Yojimbo, Rashomon, and even some of his earlier works like Drunken Angel. He's a master of his craft, and there are thousands of words written on what he's done, what he's said, and advice that he's given. But when reading Luke's writing, I'm reminded of one little anecdote about Kurosawa, a thought that has been stuck in my head ever since I first heard it. For each of his actors, he'd ask them to pick a singular movement, like a twitch or a swagger, and he'd have them repeat it throughout the film at different points and in different scenes as a way to distinguish characters even when at a distance or in a silhouette. What this was, plain and simple, was a small form of visual storytelling, and it's not complicated. It's just the old musical adage of repetition legitimizes. The act of something being repeated gives it meaning, it gives it character, and it's that word, character, that's at the root of my feelings here, because what Luke does is simple, but throughout Acid Death Fantasy there are 36 player character backgrounds, and it was this one, the Sultanless Guard and their love letter, that stuck with me the most. The other backgrounds are spectacular, hilarious, would even be a thrill to play, but none of the others give you a role quite as easily as the Sultanless Guard does. You know, they're called tabletop role-playing games, but often that role that you play is more of a self-insert or even portal fantasy in nature. It's you, but in Fantasyland. But there's something special about taking on a role outside of yourself, of carrying a love letter, like an empty bucket that you dump your own life into. There's something magical there, something beyond the game. There was a moment rather early on in my travels through the Zero when I realized I wasn't myself anymore, and I was, in fact, someone else. I picked up a die that was discarded underneath a gas station where ghosts played a familiar game, and I was asked a question. It was a simple question, and it would be easy for me to discard the dialogue options given as not important. They don't impact the game. They don't change the outcome. If I listened to most people, it would be that cause and effect that changes a game into a role-playing game. In Mass Effect 2, for instance, a crew member died during the final mission, and when I look back at it, things could have been a lot worse. Everyone could have died. Commander Shepard, could have died, and that's true role-playing, isn't it? My actions led to a different ending than someone else had. But there was something special, even more important, about these dialogue options in Kentucky Route Zero than any game with multiple endings. And it's because I realized that of the options the game gave me, each one was true. They were all correct. Each one a thought that had entered the head of the character that I played as, and it was up to me to decide which one of the thoughts got verbalized. Steven Universe. Steven Universe taught me that a thought is just a thought. They're important to our internal understanding of ourselves, but in the end, they are just thoughts. But to verbalize one, to be able to choose which one to verbalize for a character, I was making more than just a simple choice that would change the story. I was expressing character. All throughout the rest of the Zero, I was making choices of what to express. Despite my melancholic thoughts, would I share those with a kid who maybe needed some hope? When I was feeling lost and ready to give up, did I think that hearing something happy would help me? When it came to my addiction, what did I choose to share? Did I really want help, or was I ready to take the final trip and float on down the river?
This world is not my home. I'm just passing through.
When this song started playing, I felt goosebumps. Because in that moment, it was expressing something true about myself. Or, I guess, the character that I had become. It just felt so honest.
Feel at home in this world anymore.
That moment will stick with me, the person writing this, forever, because in that moment, I became someone else.
I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home,
maybe I'm the Sultanless Guard carrying this love letter. I roll my dice, make my checks and saves, and travel the sandy sea with this burden. My first partner and I wrote a lot of letters to each other. We were young and in whatever kind of love is possible at that age. It was a lot of fun, despite the things that surrounded us. An old coal mining rush town, left and forgotten. Her family and the racism of her stepfather. We were just kids, so what could we do but be helpless to it all? A few weeks ago, now that there's more than a decade and a half between then and now, a friend and I were talking about the people that my hometown has absorbed and forgotten. And I remembered her. even all these years later, she still exists within me. Even as the Sultan leaves the sands and settles down, what becomes of that love letter? What becomes of the sand dunes and giant worms? Revachol is a city of characters, and you spend the entire game talking to them. There's Kuno, the kid with a big personality and a massive drug problem. Everett Clare, the union leader who has the most uncomfortable chair in the world and demands that you sit in it, which can actually kill you. By the way, I think we might need to stop collectively as a culture and talk about that one day. There's Titus Hardy, Lawrence Gart, Lena, Kim Kitsuragi. So many personalities and so many interesting conversations. And yet, the thing that put me into the world, into the shell of the detective, were not those characters that operated inside of the world, but it was the characters inside of the detective. There's a large section of games that are said to have RPG elements because they have stats, skill trees, upgradable abilities. And while those choices may be an expression of how you want to play the game, Disco Elysium uses them as an expression of character. The skills each have their own voice, sometimes literally.
There is nothing, only warm primordial blackness.
Behind the scenes, there are constant die rolls and skill checks to see which stat is going to talk at any particular time. The more points you put into a stat, the more likely that stat will speak, and the more powerful that voice will be. Like the dialogue options in Kentucky Route Zero, each of the stats exist within the amnesiac detective at all times, and your choices decide which come to the forefront. It's hard for me to express how clever this is to the act of role-playing. To have the different parts of yourself talking to you and having to respond to them. It's a way of personifying thought, making it impossible to not interact with the character in front of you because you are effectively taking on the role of their thoughts, or at least reacting to their thoughts. What makes that doubly special is that you're still haunted by the ghosts of the detective's past. You are not given this open-ended life that you get to make what you can of. You're given a broken man with a lot of mistakes that you, as the player, are forced to account for. The man is carrying more than one love letter inside of him, the metaphorical kind and even the literal kind, in a way. He has a past beyond you as a person, but that you as a person with memories and mistakes of your own can sink into. You cross the bridge on Wednesday and head towards the fishing village, but your visual calculus speaks to you, telling you that something has happened here, something bad. You follow the trail of debauchery to the coast and find a destroyed car, and you are flooded with questions. Whose car is this? Why did they crash? Was it the murderer as they fled? This could be a huge break in the case. Halfway through the week, and you are finally starting to make an impact. You are finally starting to throw off the drunken aesthetic and find a real clue that might lead to the ending of this wild ride. Or so I thought, for a moment. Just as the detective did. But then it dawned on me. Inland Empire talks to me, and I have to ignore it because this mess is mine. The car, the lost gun, the lost badge. I'm just a wreck. For the first time in the game, I was utterly stunned. I took my hands off the mouse and keyboard because in that moment, I was the character. They took me beyond the game and into a role. If I started writing this to find some kind of commonality between the various moments of role-playing that I've had, or if I started it to find some kind of universal understanding of role-playing, I don't know if I'm any closer to it. It simultaneously has to do with choice and the lack of choice. To play a role, it's not enough to make decisions. You have to make decisions that only the character would make. And to do that, you need to be given decisions that only the character would make. It's like when in The Last of Us 2, you as a human being want to spare this woman who is begging for her life. You've killed her friends and she's all that's left, but you can't spare her. It's impossible to spare her because to Ellie, it isn't a choice. Or more so, she's already made the choice. And it's this illusion of choice that makes the game so uncomfortable, because you can't be yourself and do the things that you do in that game. You have to be Ellie. Gradient Descent dropped on my front lawn like a death note. Sean McCoy standing in the clouds as my Shinigami, cackling as I flip over the book and find myself unable to leave the deep, the monolithic android factory at the center of this mothership adventure. I didn't even know I was there already, but I guess that's how they get you. I won't pretend for a moment that Gradient Descent is doing something new in the face of sci-fi tropes. It is dealing with the themes of what it means to be human. Are you an android? Have you always been? It, as a book, is an extended romp through that scene in Ex Machina where Caleb cuts into his own flesh to see if he is, in fact, a human or just a machine. But, as a book, Gradient Descent does more to push you into that position than the entirety of Ex Machina possibly could. And it does it with just one thing: the back cover of the book. Gradient Descent is an adventure book for the Mothership tabletop role-playing game. There is a dungeon, monsters, treasure. The second heading of the book reads Content and Player Agency, and states very clearly that the book deals with its themes through a game mechanic called the bins. But I disagree. Sorry, Sean. The bins isn't the force of roleplay, and it is only through roleplay that such a theme as Am I Human can be truly explored, felt. And it's not the bins that will make Caleb stand in front of that mirror and see what's underneath his skin. No, you have to be there. It's not enough to say memory lapse. You can't recall certain details about your past. Gain 1d10 bins. Because that, well, to be frank, it doesn't mean anything on its own. If someone tells you you can't recall certain details about your past, it's hard to pretend to forget things that you know. Not like in Disco Elysium, when you literally don't remember anything because you, the player, weren't there for it. And it's the revelation of those things that happened when you, the player, weren't there that ultimately roots you in the now, that takes you beyond the game and into a role. So if you get a 21 on your bins check and it says simulation, you are dreaming and none of this is real, you really have to go against whatever your mind is telling you to be able to accomplish acting out such a thing. And I don't think that's taking on a role. But if you search the area and find a battered postcard of the place you were born, dated to the exact day of your birth, okay, maybe that's not so bad. You can reason that away, right? You weren't born in isolation, surely, so a photograph from that place has to be common, at least, or at least something that doesn't raise too many alarm bells. So what if it's dated to the exact day of your birth? Surely others were born on that day too, and even if not, it's just a single day, just one of many. So you move on. It's alright. You're definitely human. It doesn't matter what the bins says. You enjoy some drinks with your friends around the table. You banter back and forth. The encounters go alright. You all make some stress tests and come out the other end of a rough shot, searching for some more junk. You gotta find that treasure after all. Make that money. But instead, you find something peculiar. A corpse. Was it part of that last firefight you had? I mean, probably, but who can really tell? Was anybody keeping track? And really, that's not even the part that catches your eye. There's something familiar about this corpse. In fact, it looks eerily similar to another crew member, only a little older. And you can't really tell if this thing is an android unless you drag it all the way back to a scanner. That's how convincing most of these androids have been so far. And up until this point, it was just creepy set dressing. But now, you start to wonder, wouldn't an android look younger than the human counterpart, not older? You know, because when it's made, it probably keeps that age, like that it was made at. Meanwhile, the human continues to age and develop and sag. Of course, the friend says that this is just something creepy meant to freak everybody out. There's no way that they could be an android. They made their character. They would know. But you're not so sure. You know what's at the bottom of the bins table. Regardless, you continue. You find a few other interesting things. A destroyed book that says it was written by you. That's something that you can just laugh off. You find a stack of journalists' materials that show that you were interviewed about the Deep years ago, but you don't remember that. So how could that be? And you even find a tooth. Your tooth. Rest assured, all of the teeth in your mouth are accounted for, but this one here that you've just found is undeniably yours. It's one of those things that you look at and just know on an instinctual level. And maybe you just tuck that tooth into a pocket and keep that discovery to yourself. Wouldn't want to scare the other crew members. Later on, you find a teenager's diary amongst the wreckage. And after reading a few pages, it becomes clear that it belongs to one of your fellow crewmates. Nearby, there's ammunition for each of you. Exactly one bullet for the exact guns that each of you are toting. You find a video cassette that contains footage of your dream, something that couldn't exist unless your dreams were implanted. These things compound one after another, and suddenly you don't need a bins roll to tell you that maybe the other crewmates are fake, that maybe you're fake. You reach one of those scanners I mentioned back when you found that corpse, a cybernetic diagnostic scanner. The only way to know if someone is an android or a human, but you don't enter it. Why would you? If you did, and it blinked android, what would you do? Tell your crewmates that it's a lie? Would you believe them if they stepped in and it flashed android? And of course, you, the person, the player playing the game, knows that none of this could possibly be true. You sat and rolled the dice to make this character. You would know if they were an android. You would have chosen that from the jump. But in the Deep, that doesn't seem to matter, does it? As I said, if a crewmate stepped into the cybernetic diagnostic scanner and it flashed android, would you believe them if they gave that excuse? Or would you use that one bullet you found for your gun to stop them before they could clone you too? Gradient Descent is role-playing. It gives you no other choice. Even if you never question your own reality, it's impossible to not question the reality of your crewmates, of the world around you. Every new person you meet could be an android, and they each think the same thing about you. You find a radio that's blaring a distress signal. On the other end is a familiar voice, and you're afraid to help them. Eventually, though, you find the room that they've sealed themselves in, and inside, beyond the door, is a duplicate of yourself. Afraid for their life. Afraid that they're an android. Just like you. Do you trust your crewmates to believe you when you tell them that you're not the fake? If you left the room, hypothetically, and let them choose between you and this duplicate, would they choose the right one? When you come back to the table and sit at your character sheet, can you be sure that they chose the right one? Or did you come back just to play as the android? If they want to go to the scanner, do you refuse? There was an acting teacher who sums this whole thing up quite nicely by saying that acting is behaving truthfully under imaginary circumstances. I think that if you just replace acting with role-playing, you've hit the nail on the head. How this acting teacher accomplished teaching such a nebulous thing was through reaction. Acting is reacting, he said. Luke Gearing, like this acting coach, places the love letter on the Sultanless Guard and waits for reaction. Kentucky Route Zero gives you 3 true answers to a single question and forces you to make a decision. Disco Elysium reveals your past and makes you responsible for it. And though I'm not sure if it was Luke specifically, he did have a hand in it at least. In Gradient Descent, he places an audio cassette on the random search table. When you listen to it, you hear your own voice and the voice of your fellow crewmates arguing. You all want to leave the deep because you're all afraid that one of you is an android. The recording plays out an entire conversation, only you don't remember having this conversation, and you definitely don't remember recording it. Then the cassette pops and cracks with loud gunfire. Bangs and screams echo out, distorted through your speakers, then silence. Now, react. Oh yeah, and I ran a poll for this, so sorry Luke, but you're a mean-head jerk. Good day.
Black smoke's a horizon and it surely is a train. I'm on